Hello and welcome to lesson 2 of week 8 of the NPTEL MOOCs course on economic growth and development. In this week and in the preceding week so far, we have studied the concepts of Gender Development Index and the Gender Empowerment Measure. We saw that there has been a lot of emphasis on this concept of Gender Development Index, primarily because there is a reason to measure what are the different levels of achievements of men and women, what are the different gender relations that have been prescribed for men and women in our societies. We have also had a very brief discussion into the fact that there are a lot of efforts towards coming up with what is called a gender inequality index. Now, what do all of these measurements or efforts towards measurement of the different outcomes of men and women show? It shows that somewhere there are different levels of achievements of men and women, and therefore there needs to be a lot of study with regard to gender inequality in our society. In today's class, we will look at this concept. We will study the concept of gender mainstreaming, and this concept of gender mainstreaming has entered into the literature of development since the middle of the 1990s. Although work on the policy of gender mainstreaming has taken place in development literature, particularly through the studies of carried out by feminist theorists for a considerably long period of time. In this class, we will study the concept of gender mainstreaming in three aspects. First, in the first part of the lecture, I'll try to lay the foundation as to why look at gender mainstreaming, or why it became important to study gender mainstreaming as it is. In the second part of this lecture, we will look at the policy of gender mainstreaming, the way it was introduced, and in the third part of the lecture, we will look at one of the instruments of gender mainstreaming, and this is one of the most widely used instruments of gender mainstreaming. It is also known as a policy instrument, and this instrument is therefore named as gender budgeting. So, going by these perspectives on how to approach this concept of gender mainstreaming, I have titled today's lecture as Gender Mainstreaming and Gender Budgeting. This lecture comes to you as a general lecture, and I believe that this needs to be taken at this point of time for students to understand that since there are different outcomes as far as development achievements are concerned with respect to men and women, therefore it is but appropriate that we keep aside one class on the issue of gender inequality and consequently on gender mainstreaming. So, to begin with, let us first we have in our previous classes seen that there are different outcomes with respect to deprivations and achievements of men and women. But let us, to understand the concept of gender mainstreaming, let us begin with this idea of how poverty has been conceptualized for a very long period of time. Now, conceptualization of poverty has more or less always been done in terms of incomes needed to achieve a predetermined and physiologically defined level of survival by members of the average household. So, who are the members within the household is something which is never discussed at length, but if you look at policy documents at the national level or at the sub-regional levels, one of the things that is emphasized on is what are the levels of deprivations or what are the levels of achievements faced by the households. So, in that sense, the term household is used as some sort of a generic term, irrespective of who are the constituent members of those households. So, that's the standard conceptualization of poverty. And the poverty line then serves to distinguish the poor from the non-poor within a population. And as I've just said, in early research on poverty, it was always assumed that households were internally unified and that their incomes were equitably distributed among their members, and consequently all members of households were thought to be likely to be equally poor or equally well off. So, the standard assumption was that if incomes of households are rising, all the members within the household are equally well off, yeah, without paying any attention to the intra-household distribution of income. What is the share of women and children on income within those households? So little attention was paid on this aspect of intra-household distribution of resources in early poverty literature. But beginning the 1980s and the 1990s, because of the work led by various feminist theorists as well as gender equality practitioners, serious challenges came against this assumption, and this was also based upon empirical evidence that income deficits impinged more severely and systematically on some members of the households than others, and most often along lines of gender and age. And this is something that we have done as a matter of assumptions. When we began studying the issue of human development, we saw that women and children within a household are generally the more marginalized and more vulnerable. This assumption that households are internally unified and all incomes are equally distributed among all members of the family was challenged by various feminist theorists and gender equality practitioners, and empirical evidences showed that the outcomes on women and girls and children are especially much different than what the outcomes for adult male members within the family in general are. So therefore this assumption came under a serious challenge along lines of gender and age. And in this sense, there was then a need to deconstruct the concept of households. Who are the constituent members of these households? And there was a need to ask questions about the intra-household distribution of well-being, so that and that became the first step in understanding the process of developing a gendered understanding of poverty. So in that sense, the term poverty was no longer used in a very generic sense, because it came to be understood in light of the empirical evidences that started getting available in terms of the international development literature, that poverty, the concept of poverty in itself is a highly gendered one. And therefore it revealed the relevance of identity based inequalities even among the poor. So we cannot just talk in terms of vertical inequalities or vertical poverty, but also in terms of horizontal inequalities that exist, because people belonging to different gender, different social groups of population, people belonging to different race and ethnicity often face different experiences with regard to poverty. In the last class, I had shown you a small video clip on how different poorer people conceptualize poverty, or how poorer people see themselves as poor, and what being poor means. And you would see that the men and women in those videos spoke very differently about their conditions of living. So therefore it is but obvious by now that the nature of poverty itself is multifaceted, which is why today we have moved from a simple human development index calculation to a multidimensional poverty index. Now that brings us to the understanding of how to look at poverty. A very noted economist named Naila Kabeer has spoken in terms of poverty as a state of being and poverty as a process. She has worked in detail on poverty, gender and poverty in Bangladesh, and from her experiences from there she has talked about poverty as a state of being and as a process. And for our understanding of what is gender mainstreaming, we can also begin understanding poverty as a state and as a process. So if we have to express poverty as a state, we can think of it as a snapshot view of basic needs deficits of the poor at a particular point of time. So if at a particular point of time there are deficiency in wages or deficiencies in incomes of a particular household, of an average household, such that the basic amenities of living are not available, say food, education, housing, health and so on, then we can say that this is a state of being poor, or there is a state of poverty. But poverty can also be seen as a process, which means then that there needs to be a lot of focus on the causes and mechanisms of the generation and transmission of poverty over time, how poverty came to be. So if there are, for example, if in the Indian context, let's say caste plays a very important role in conceptualization of poverty. and you would see that there are various causal factors that go to determine the state of being poor within the Indian context, let's say. So in that sense, there needs to be a focus on the causes and mechanisms of the generation and transmission of poverty over time. And needless to say, both of these concepts, poverty as a state and poverty as a process, are closely interrelated, because deficits in need at any particular point in time are both outcomes of ongoing processes of poverty and contributory factors. However, it was important to distinguish this between poverty as a state and poverty as a process, because the empirical fact is that women and men experience the state of poverty differently and often unequally, and become impoverished through processes that sometimes diverge. Since the relations of power within a household, relations of power within a community, within a nation, within a state are very different. Therefore, the processes through which men and women experience poverty often diverge. And this is one of the important contexts that we need to keep in mind when understanding the concept of gender mainstreaming. Now, apart from the fact that paucity of incomes or deficits in incomes is one of the important reasons of poverty, or the fact that men and women face different experiences in life and therefore they experience poverty differently, is an underlying factor. We also need to understand poverty in terms of its multidimensionality and intersectionality. So gender differences in the priorities expressed by poor people, the differences that reflect the roles and responsibilities assigned to men and women by households and communities, is one of the important beginning points to understanding or conceptualization of poverty. Often we see that in village economies or even in urban economies, urban informal sectors, you would see that there are clear gender differences in the priorities expressed by poor people, and different roles are assigned to men and women in the workplace or within the households and within the communities, and that is intrinsic to understanding the gendered nature of poverty. We have also seen empirical evidences have shown us that women have greater workloads, and therefore there is a concept of time poverty which has come into being. Different kinds of time use surveys have shown us that women undergo a lot of manual labor. There is a lot of time and effort that goes into the women's work, and that has given rise to the concept of time poverty. Other kinds of quantitative assessments have shown us that it is the intersection rather than the addition of different kinds of inequalities, vertical as well as horizontal, that adds to the concept of extreme poverty. Or there are various kinds of disadvantages that people face at a given point of time. So men and women belonging to different communities face poverty differently. So if we are let's say to take an example, if we are comparing the state of poverty between an upper caste urban woman and a lower caste rural woman, then probably their conceptualization of poverty will be very different, because the disadvantages faced by these two different categories of women on a daily basis are very different. So gender inequality often cuts across both vertical inequalities and horizontal inequalities, including race and caste. And it is this intersection with these other forms of inequality which means that it is women and girls from the poorest caste, ethnic and racial groups who have poorer levels of health, nutrition and education, and very often suffer higher levels of violence than other women, including women from similarly poor backgrounds. So this is extremely important when we are talking in terms of intersectionalities and faced the intersectionalities with respect to the disadvantages faced by women from different backgrounds. So often we see that women and girls from the poorest caste, ethnic and racial groups have poorer levels of achievement outcomes with respect to health and nutrition or education, and they often also face very high levels of violence than other women. Therefore, it is important to provide attention to the intersectionalities when we are coming up with the conceptualization of poverty, and that is where it is no longer relevant that we be gender blind or gender neutral with respect to framing different kinds of policies. Different kinds of policies need to be framed when when there is an overwhelming gender inequality prevalent within societies. Now, gender inequality is also an efficiency issue. When we see that there are different levels of gender inequalities within a society, the returns to income or the level of national output that is being produced within an economy also gets affected. Generally, in economics, when we try to assess assess a policy, we tend to look at the efficiency aspects and the equity aspects of a certain policy, and often there is a trade-off between efficiency and equity. So while dealing with gender inequalities is definitely a rights-based issue, it's definitely an equity issue, it is also an efficiency issue, and very carefully carried out empirical work on measurements of gender inequality with respect to incomes or output has shown us so. Here in this slide I have taken some examples without references, but these are empirically established, and in the concluding lecture of this course I will give out the references from where I have provided these evidences on reduction in output or income because of greater levels of gender inequality. So, for example, research on agricultural productivity in Africa shows that reducing gender inequality could significantly increase agricultural yields, because then labor absorption of women within agriculture would increase, and that would also go on to raise agricultural productivity. Women farmers in Kenya, there was a study on women farmers in Kenya which showed that if the same level of agricultural inputs and education are provided to the women farmers in Kenya as men farmers, there could increase yields obtained by women farmers by more than 20%, and this is based upon an empirical evidence. So you see how bridging the gap of gender inequity or gender inequality can go a long way in increasing national output within a country. Similarly, everything else being equal, countries in which the ratio of female to male achievement enrollments in primary or secondary education is less than 0.75 can expect levels of GNP that are roughly 25% lower than countries in which there is less gender disparity. And there are increasing evidence on educational enrollments coming from countries across the world that high rates of enrollment of girl children accompanied with high retention of girl children in schools give rise to increase in national output over a period of time, because the contribution of women and girls to national output increases over a period of time if the quality of human capital increases. A study carried out in Latin America showed that if gender inequality in the labor market in Latin America were to be eliminated, not only could women's wages rise by about 50%, but national output could also rise by 5%. And similarly, on the lines of human development achievements, it is an empirical fact by now, and also a stylized fact by now, that the probability of children being enrolled in school increases with their mother's educational level, and any extra income that goes to mothers will always have a more positive impact on household investment in nutrition, health and education of children than extra income going to fathers. And even studies within India has shown us that with every 1% rise in incomes of the female heads within the households, there is an increased investment on education or health of children within the households than any increase in income to fathers. So that clearly establishes the fact that intra-household distribution of resources is highly unequal, and therefore one needs to lay a lot of attention or emphasis on what is the share of women in the total household income and what is the share of men in the total household income. And empirical evidences show us that any increase in women's incomes definitely go into improving human development achievements within the household, and if this added up, will also go on to increase in human development achievements within the nation as a whole. So having given you a context of why studying gender inequality is important, we now look into this concept of gender mainstreaming. What does this concept mean? When did it come into existence? And what are the principles associated with this concept of gender mainstreaming? So if if one has to come up with a very working definition of what is gender mainstreaming, we can say that it is a process that seeks to advance gender equality by revising all mainstream policy arenas. So it is a process that seeks to advance gender equality by revising all mainstream policy arenas. It is also intended as a way of improving the effectiveness of mainline policies by making visible the gendered nature of assumptions, processes and outcomes. Now we have already seen that there are certain gendered assumptions or gender blind assumptions with respect to how total household incomes or total household achievements will rise if incomes rises, but the empirical evidences show that there are serious challenges to these kinds of assumptions. So gender mainstreaming is a process that seeks to advance gender equality by revising all mainstream policy arenas, and during its development as a policy initiative there has been significant exchange of ideas between feminist theories of gender relations and gender equality practitioners. So gender mainstreaming may be introduced as a form of gendered political and policy practice that arose in the early 1990s, and as an international phenomenon it originated in development policies and was adopted by the UN at the 1995 Conference on Women in Beijing and was subsequently taken up by the European Union and its member states. So gender mainstreaming is a highly political process of trying to understand the gendered relations that exist within the society, whether it is in the work domain, whether it is in the household domain, and it spreads across and it can be extended to different domains within the society and the economy, and therefore it is a lens which is used to look at the existing inequalities or inequities of men and women in different domains, and then it seeks to advance gender equality by revising all of these mainstream policy arenas. This is a brief chart of its evolution. In terms of its evolution, the principle of gender mainstreaming was developed by feminist development practitioners in the 1970s, but it was launched formally at the UN Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. And as I have already mentioned, its origins lie especially in the context of feminist work within development, where different ways of including gender equity within development processes and goals had long been explored. And since the UN Conference of Gender Mainstreaming adopted by EU, the European Union adopted gender mainstreaming as its gender policy, and it deepened since the Treaty of Amsterdam, which was basically a meeting of European Union countries, and in which they deepened the process of gender mainstreaming by adopting various gender aware policies. In terms of coverage, gender mainstreaming is a global initiative and it is not evenly developed globally. So which means that there are some countries which have taken up proactively different gender mainstreaming policies, and some countries even have not even begun yet with respect to gender mainstreaming. So implementation of gender mainstreaming is uneven even when led by a common transnational political entity such as the European Union. So various developing countries of the world and why the developing countries, even many developed countries of the world, have not been able to initiate the gender mainstreaming policies within different domains within the country. In terms of coverage, the understanding of gender mainstreaming raises complex questions as to the relationship between global, regional and national levels of governance, and this is all the more important because gender mainstreaming as a policy is not situated within a country context. It is transnational from the very beginning. So it was adopted by the UN as a matter of policy, and the flavor of gender mainstreaming as a policy has been absolutely transnational. Therefore, it cannot be situated within a national or country framework. However, it can be adapted to various national and country frameworks. And there are a number of questions that remain with regard to implementation of the gender mainstreaming policy. One of the first question, because it is transnational in nature, one of the first questions which in all its complexities that need to be taken into account is what is the relationship between developing countries, European Union, US, the global and the national as sites in the development of different types of gender equality policies. Who are the countries that are takers and makers of gender mainstreaming policies and why? Do policies remain the same or are adapted according to local conditions? How important is the developing discourse on human rights, and how important are the role of institutions such as the United Nations in dealing with this concept of gender mainstreaming in different domains across different countries? So there are a complex web of questions that need to be dealt with when you're looking at a policy which is as transnational in nature as gender mainstreaming. In terms of principles of gender mainstreaming, when we are looking at it from a policy perspective, there are a number of imperatives which needs to be taken into account when one is framing a policy. Of course, a number of other principles can be added to this picture that is showing on your slide, but some of the important principles of gender mainstreaming that can be kept in mind, and this is provided by the United Nations, are as follows. First is adequate accountability mechanisms for monitoring progress. So when a certain policy is being implemented, the proper social accountability mechanisms need to be in place to check whether the benefits that are supposed to be going to the women members of a household or women members of the community are reaching them or not. So a social accountability mechanism needs to be in place to monitor the progress of a particular development policy that has been implemented. Similarly, there needs to be a proper diagnosis and identification of gender differences and disparities in certain communities, certain households, such that policy frameworks can be put into practice or policies can be framed adequately. There is a need to challenge gender neutral assumptions. Often the assumptions with regard to development issues, as for example with poverty, is gender neutral, has been gender neutral for a very long period of time. However, we have seen that the very notion of poverty itself is very gendered, and therefore there needs to be we need to pose different kinds of challenges to these gender neutral assumptions. Fourthly, there should be a political will and allocation of adequate resources for gender mainstreaming. So while on the one hand, from a normative perspective, gender mainstreaming is adopted by a certain nation or a country, there also has to be a political will to be able to keep aside certain resources that need to be targeted towards certain policies that support women and girls and so on. There is also a need to ensure that women participate in decision making processes within the household or at the level of community or at different levels of disaggregation or aggregation within a nation state. So we need to have women policy makers, women decision makers at different levels of aggregation within a country, whether at the community level, whether at the household level, whether at the block level, district level, state level, and at the level of at the national level. And there is also a need to re-emphasize on targeted women specific policies in the form of some kind of an affirmative action, such that we at least have women members at different levels of aggregation who can voice the concerns of their women counterparts, or at least challenge the different unequal power relations that exist at different levels in different domains. Now at this point, it is also important to make a distinction between two approaches to development. One is called the women in development approach, which held sway for a very long period of time in development policy thinking, and the other is the gender and development approach, which is the approach adapted by the gender mainstreaming policies. Let us look at some of the crucial differences between both of these approaches. Women in development is an approach that views women as having the problem, whereas gender in development is an approach to development which looks at the inequities faced by both men and women and the gender differences that exist within the society faced by both men and women. Through the gender and development approach, the focus is on the inequalities faced by both men and women, whereas the approach women in development focuses largely on the deprivations faced by women alone. With respect to problems, the women in development looks primarily at exclusion of women from the development process. So they are looking at the exclusion of women, also meaning the exclusion of half the productive resources from the development process, whereas gender and development looks at the unequal relations of power, be it rich and poor, men and women, that prevent equity and participation of different people in a development process. The goal of the approach of women in development is to bring about more efficient and effective development whereas the goal of the approach of gender and development model is to look at equitable, sustainable development with both women and men as decision makers. With respect to women in development approach, the solution is to integrate women into the development process, whereas gender and development focuses more on empowering the disadvantaged women and transforming unequal relations of power, also asking questions and posing challenges with respect to the unequal distribution of power that exists within a society. There are also differences with respect to the strategies followed by these two approaches, women in development and gender in development. Women in development focuses more on women's projects or women's components that tend to increase women's productivity and women's incomes. The focus primarily is on increasing women's incomes, whereas gender and development identifies and addresses practical needs determined by women and men to improve their conditions and addresses women's strategic interests by focusing on people-centered development. Final takeaway point with respect to gender mainstreaming as a policy is to challenge the gendered notions that exist with respect to to poverty and development in different domains, whether it is in health, whether it is in education, food, agriculture and so on, and then to frame and implement policies that takes into account all of these unequal sharing of power between men and women, and then devise policies that can challenge these notions and talk about development as a process for both men and women within given situations, and that is what will be referred to as gender mainstreaming. Now in this last part of this lecture, we will look at an instrument of gender mainstreaming. One of the most widely used instruments of gender mainstreaming is what is referred to as gender budgeting, and some countries across the world have introduced this instrument of gender budgeting in their budgeting exercises, and India is no exception. In India too, we have had a number of gender budgeting experiences, notwithstanding the fact that there are still limitations to this exercise of gender budgeting, but some beginning has already been made. So in this last part of the lecture, let us look at what does this concept of gender budgeting mean, and what are its constituent components, and what does it mean when we say whether a budget is gender neutral or gender blind, and whether there is a need to make budgets gender sensitive. So consider this, that a budget is a financial statement of expenditures that need to be made on different heads, and so a budget on the face of it appears to be a very general gender neutral policy instrument. Hardly ever you come across budgets which made entirely for women and budgets made entirely for women. So on the face of it, a budget is a gender neutral policy instrument, and this appearance of gender neutrality can more accurately be described as being as gender blindness. So more accurately, it is basically gender blind because there is less focus or almost no focus on what expenditures need to be made on the heads of women and children and men. Although there are certain exceptions when we are looking at the social sector expenditures, often mention is made with regard to how much is being spent on women and children and so on. But on the face of it, budget appears to be a gender neutral or a gender blind policy instrument. And the presence of gender differences and inequalities means that a gender blind budget in practice tends to have different impacts on men and women, boys and girls, and in turn they tend to have different responses to the budget. Now understand this, that even though the budget is primarily a gender neutral or a gender blind policy instrument, the fact remains that there are gender inequalities within a society, and the fact that there are gender inequalities means that the starting points of boys and girls and men and women are different. Girls and women generally start at a point from a point which is much lower than boys and men within a society, and therefore if the budgets which which provides the blueprint to what kind of the design of expenditure policies that need to be made within a country within a given period of time, then obviously the outcomes on of women and girls with regard to different achievement indicators will also be very different. So the presence of gender differences and inequalities means that a gender blind budget in practice tends to have different impacts on men and women, boys and girls, and therefore they in turn will lead to different responses to the budget. and depending on how the budget and public services which it finances are structured, the outcomes for men and women can be unequal. So you can look at this example that is showing on your slide with respect to Pakistan and Kenya. Although the education budget of a country may have no intention of favoring boys over girls, the actual outcome may in fact favor boys over girls. Often when we are talking of budget scenarios, when we are, for example, when you are looking at education budget, you would see that a government during a certain period of time would have assessed that such and such amount will be spent on primary education, on secondary education, on higher education and so on. So there are no explicit points made with respect to the fact that X amount of expenditure will be made on girls or X amount of expenditure will be made on boys. But the reality is that once the expenses have been made, the outcomes that we see on boys and girls are very different, and this is shown in the form of an example here from the education budget of Pakistan and Kenya. This was compiled by World Bank in 1995. So these are 1995 figures. The public expenditure per male in Pakistan was 56 Pakistani rupees, and for female was 26 Pakistan rupees, and for Kenya the public expenditure per male was 670 and for female was 543 shillings. So this is one of the glaring examples of how, even though the intention of the policy maker may not be to favor one particular gender over the other, but the existing inequalities may be such that the expenses which are finally made may result in very divergent outcomes, very different outcomes with respect to boys and girls. So what do the existing conceptual frameworks fail to recognize? The existing conceptual frameworks fail to recognize women's contribution to macroeconomy, and it is underestimated because of missing and biased markets and incomplete statistics. In economics, we particularly in the study of macroeconomy with respect to gender or women's participation in the macroeconomy, we make use of these terms called missing markets and biased markets, and it can be very simply understood as saying that within the labor markets there are certain domains where there is a lot of bias with respect to who to employ, men and women. So for example, there are certain hazardous jobs in which the women's labor absorption is very low or almost nil. So there is a missing market with respect to women in certain economies. There are also biased markets where there is a lot of bias with regard to who should be taken in within the labor markets. So there is an existence of missing and biased markets and also incomplete statistics with respect to labor absorption, and therefore women's contribution to the macroeconomy is largely underestimated. Similarly, there is an unpaid economy in which women do most of the work of maintaining the labor force and keeping the social framework in good order, the domestic, or what is also referred to as social reproduction, and here the incidence of women is very high. There are men also living behind homes who take care of the homes, but the incidence of women in these economy is very high, and this is also rightly so referred to as the unpaid economy. There are parameters of aggregate production, saving, investment, imports and exports in the paid economy, and they may be sensitive to different patterns of gender relations and gender distribution of resources. So which means to say that because there are unequal relations with respect to gender, the parameters of production and savings and investment may also show out to be very different when calculated for male and female separately. So, but the existing conceptual frameworks, the existing economic frameworks that exist, economic frameworks in macroeconomics or microeconomics, does not take into account these differences with respect to gender, and this is one of the serious limitations. So what gender sensitive budgets may emphasize on? It may emphasize on women's contribution to the economy. So there is a need to engender macroeconomic models by so if you remember the circular flow of income and output that we were studying in lecture 1 of this course, where we had introduced the terms of households and market, we also need to categorize these agents, households and market in gender disaggregated form. So we need to know whether there are male headed households, whether there are female headed households, what is the share of contribution of men and women in the sector of the firms and so on. So there is a need to engender macroeconomic models and then devise appropriate budget strategies with respect to gender relations. How does one measure women's contribution to the macroeconomy, and what are the things that needs to be kept in mind? It needs to be kept in mind that there are certain sectors, for example, subsistence production, informal sector employment and domestic work or a productive work, which does not take into account women's work, and therefore they are finally not counted in gross national product. What is subsistence production? It is production for home use of goods, which in principle could be marketed, such as food, clothing, pottery, and in principle it should be included in the measurement of GNP, but in practice it is frequently omitted because statistical surveys do not properly count it. And who are the ones who are largely employed in the subsistence economy? It is the women of the households or the marginalized members of the household who are employed in the subsistence production. Informal sector employment, it is market oriented employment in small workshops, family businesses, subcontracted work undertaken in homes and work as domestic servants. It includes various types of occupational status as employee, self-employed and unpaid family worker. But the family member who is directing the business and who is often the male household head does receive a payment. But those who are unpaid family workers are generally the women within the households. And of course, there are domestic work or reproductive work, which is basically the work of managing a household, cooking, cleaning, fetching fuel and water, keeping home, clothing and domestic equipment in good repair, and caring for family members. This is also referred to as the care economy. And in principle, it is excluded from the GNP. It is defined in the UN system of national accounts as lying outside the production behavior. And over a period of time, attempts have been made to include work that is being done in the care economy into the UN system of national accounts by creating what is called a satellite account. However, even today in terms of GNP accounting, we hardly see work which is being done in the unpaid care economy being included in GNP calculations. Now this is an example of gender blind model. If you remember the circular flow of national income that we have studied earlier, this is a classic example of how gender relations are not taken into account when we are thinking in terms of the circular flow of incomes and output within an economy. So in this vision, households do not produce, their only function is to save or spend. So if you see there are arrows going out to the firms, the households spend in terms of consumption expenditure, and they also save, so which is that there is a leakage in terms of savings, and they receive incomes from the firms. So what is the function of the households here? The function of the households is only to save or spend. They are only consumers. Nor does the government spending create growth for the future. Its main role, the role of the government here, is to redistribute income and to increase aggregate demand. The stock of natural resources, the stock of labor and the social framework of civic responsibility is taken for granted, and no work is required to maintain these resources. Now gender can be very well introduced into such kind of a gender blind model, and the most obvious disaggregation is to distinguish male and female headed households here. So this component of households that you see here, the component of households that you see here can be very well disaggregated by bringing in male headed and female headed households, and the financial flows into and out of these gender differentiated units could then in principle be distinguished. Let us have a look at a very simplified gender aware model here. Let us have a look at a gender aware model here. In this you would see that the household and community care economy has been introduced. The private sector or the firm has been replaced with private commodity economy. Government has been replaced with the public service economy, and the household has been replaced with what is called the household and community care economy. So what are we doing in this model is we have incorporated the care economy into macroeconomic thinking by focusing on the circular flow of national output, seeing national output as a product of the interaction of three sectors, the private sector commodity economy, the public service economy, and the household and the community care economy. Now, creation of wealth in this country depends on the output of all three sectors, and sometimes there is a tendency to assume that the wealth creating sector is the private commodity economy, while the public service economy and the household and the community care economy spend what the private commodity economy has produced. And this mistaken view results from considering the circular flow of national income in isolation from the circular flow of national output. Whereas the three sectors of the economy can be very well considered to be interdependent here. So, in this gender aware model, the household and community care economy does not simply have the job of spending of consumption, expenditure and savings, they also create human capacities here. So, you can see that for maintaining the social fabric of the economy, they create human capacities which then enter into the public service economy, and this creation of human capacities also support the private commodity economy. So, there is a lot of contribution of the household and community care economy in the private commodity economy. They also, the public service economy also which in the previous case focused only on redistribution of resources. Here the public service economy provides social and physical infrastructure to the private commodity economy to be able to provide private commodities. The public service economy also provides social and physical infrastructure to the household and community economy, and then consumption and investment commodities then go into household and community care economy. So, this is a very simplified visualization of how a gender aware model can look like, and these models can also be incorporated into the macroeconomic models. So, what are the questions that these circular flow of income models by engendering the macroeconomic models can go on to ask? They can go on to ask the following questions. First, what proportion of government spending is directed to female headed firms and what proportion to male headed firms? So, in the gender aware model, as you have seen here, the private commodity economy can also be disaggregated in terms of male headed firms and female headed firms, and then we can ask questions with regard to what is the wealth created by male headed firms and female headed firms and so on. So, there is one way of engendering macroeconomic models. We can also ask questions as to, do male headed firms display different investment and export behavior from female headed firms? Do male headed firms display different income generating behavior from female headed firms? Similarly, if public procurement policies were changed so as to offer more opportunities to female headed firms, what would be the implications for investment, exports and income flows? What proportion of national income accrues to female headed and what to male headed households? Are the shares in income the same as shares in population, or do female headed households get disproportionately less income? Does the savings and expenditure behavior of male and female headed households differ? For instance, do female headed households have a greater tendency to spend in ways that directly benefit children or save a larger proportion of their income or consumer less imports? Would human resource development be improved by a redistribution of income to female headed households? So, one of the central facts with regard to gender budgeting is to come up with engendered macroeconomic models by engendering macroeconomic models by asking questions with respect to how income is generated and what share of the income accrues to male headed households, female headed households, or male headed firms and female headed firms. And once we start asking these questions with respect to these engendered models, then we will see that the parameters of savings, investment, imports and exports will also change, and the patterns of imports and exports and consumption and savings will also change when we are analyzing this in terms of gender disaggregated ways. So, what is a gender responsive budget then? A gender responsive budget initiative, first of all, does not aim to produce a separate budget for women. So, one of the first things that we need to understand is the gender responsive budget does not mean that we devise separate budgets for men and women. Instead, it aims to analyze any form of public expenditure or method of raising public money from a gender perspective, identifying the implications and impacts for women and girls as compared to men and boys. So, the forms of public expenditure or analysis of public expenditures need to be made in gendered ways, and the key questions to ask is what impact does a fiscal measure have on gender equality? Does it reduce gender inequality, increase it, or leave it unchanged? And the focus on gender inequality can be structured so as to take account of other forms of inequalities or intersectionalities, as we were talking about in terms of class, race and religion. And a gender budget initiative always should involve some kind of a gender analysis of some dimension of the raising and use of public money. Now, one of the ways in which gender responsive budget can make a difference is how we present the findings and results of a gender analysis of budget. And one of the ways in which the finding can be presented is as is being shown on your slide here. We need to focus on the political location, the coverage, the budget classification, presentation of analysis and the stage of the budget cycle. So, in terms of the political location, we can focus on whether we are talking about a national budget, a regional budget or local level government budget, whether we are talking about budgets inside government departments organized by officials and ministers, in elected assemblies organized by elected representatives, or outside government organized by researchers and civil society organization. In terms of coverage, we can think of a budget in terms of the whole budget, whether the whole budget can be put in terms of some gendered analysis, which is rarely ever attempted till date. Similarly, expenditure of selected departments or programs, expenditure on new projects and selected forms of revenue, changes in tax system or new legislation. Budget classifications can be made in such a manner: expenditure by payments, functional expenditure by broad purposes, economic financial operations by economic impact, administrative expenditure by institution responsible for managing funds, expenditures according to programs considered as a set of activities undertaken to meet the same objectives, and territorial revenues and expenditures by geographical area of impact. In terms of presentation of analysis, results of gender analysis of expenditure and revenues may be presented in different ways and by different actors at a number of points in the main budget, in a special annex to the main budget, or in briefing papers for parliamentarians, even in terms of research papers by academicians, and the stage of budget cycle by planning to identify objectives, appraisal to identify financial allocations, audit to identify any misappropriation of money, and evaluation of the extent to which objectives have been met. So, this is a snapshot view of how a gender analysis of a budget can be presented, and gender budgeting mainly tries to look at a gender analysis of how expenditures are made in different domains of an economy, whether it is in the transport sector, whether it is in the social services sector, whether it is in the sector of education and health disaggregated within the social services sector, and so on. So, in this class we got introduced to the context of gender mainstreaming. We saw that the very notion of poverty itself may be very gendered, and there are various intersectionalities to understanding the concept of poverty, and that background is important, or that background lays the foundation for what we know is gender mainstreaming, how gender mainstreaming has been devised. We also saw that gender mainstreaming is a transnational policy. It cuts across territories, it cuts across national boundaries, it has a very transnational reach in terms of being a policy instrument, and it can be implemented in various ways at various levels of disaggregation within the economy, within the national borders. We also had a brief look into the instrument, one of the instruments of gender mainstreaming, which is called gender budgeting, and this is increasingly being used as one of the most important tools of gender mainstreaming to look at to carry out a gender analysis of various kinds of policies, so as to see what are the different outcomes with respect to human development achievements or deprivations when it comes to men and women and boys and girls. We will end today's class with this. In the next lecture, we will summarize the course on economic growth and development, and we will look at some of the way forward when it comes to research with respect to growth and development. Thank you.